This is Wendy Halley, and you're listening to Lucid Cafe. Thanks for joining me. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Rick Strassman. He's a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico's School of Medicine and the president and co-founder of the Cottonwood Research Foundation. From 1990 to 1995, he performed the first new human studies with psychedelic drugs in the U.S. in more than 20 years, focusing on the powerful naturally occurring compound DMT. He's the author of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, and the co-author of Inner Paths to Outer Space. All right, where to begin? I should probably start by admitting that I struggled a bit with this interview. If you're a regular listener, you know that I'm really intrigued by the possibilities of psychedelic-assisted therapy. So the idea of having a conversation with the first researcher in decades who was able to get approval to do psychedelic-based studies was really appealing. When I reached out to Rick and asked him if he'd come on the podcast, I told him he could talk about whatever he wanted. And he graciously agreed, and in preparation for the interview, gave me the homework assignment of reading his book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, A New Science of Spiritual Revelation in the Hebrew Bible. I have to confess that I picked up this book when it first came out in 2014, and I didn't get very far. So I picked it up again and read the whole thing. In the book, Dr. Strassman looks to the Old Testament as a way to develop a better model for understanding the DMT experience and claims that the visions of the Hebrew prophets were strikingly similar to those of the volunteers in his DMT studies. A couple of things. First, I really had a tough time seeing the similarities he was pointing out in the book. They didn't seem like a slam dunk to me. And then, secondly, it's no secret that I'm not a fan of religion of any kind. Because of this, I went back and forth about whether or not I should even do the interview, but changed my mind, thinking that maybe our conversation could help me see what I wasn't able to in the book. Well, now that we've had the conversation, I'm still not there. So yeah, for the first time since starting the podcast, I'm talking with someone whose ideas I simply disagree with. Sounds like life, right? Not everyone's going to agree with you, but it's not personal. It's just a different perspective. Rick is clearly very passionate about the Old Testament, what he refers to as the Hebrew Bible, and it's abundantly clear that I'm not a religious scholar, and am actually not interested in being one. My goal was to approach the conversation from a place of curiosity, but I did find myself pushing back a bit when the topic turned to God. If you're interested, at the end of the episode, I share the reason why I struggle so much with religion. So let's get to it. I bring you my conversation with Dr. Rick Strassman. Rick, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Wendy, for the invitation.
All right. So what do you want to talk about? I'm just kidding.
Oh, any number of things. I'm game.
Well, you are most known for your work with DMT. What would you say if you were to kind of encapsulate all of your work? What would you want people to know about your work, your findings?
What do I want people to know about my work? Well, that may relate. Well, is that the same as a legacy?
Sure.
Well, I study the Hebrew Bible pretty much all the time, every day. And the two main messages of the Old Testament is that there's one God, that's the right belief, and the right behavior, the right action is the golden rule. Love your neighbor, love your fellow as yourself. So if I want to be known for anything, it's popularizing those two notions, that there's one God and that the standard for social behavior is the golden rule.
I did not expect you to go there right off the bat. So, not for your work so much. You don't want to be known for your DMT studies.
Um, well, in a lot of ways, the DMT work was just a prelude to the more serious work. The DMT work was an attempt to somehow pigeonhole spiritual experience, to reduce it somehow. And when I found that couldn't be done, then I started asking the deeper questions, which were things like, what is spiritual experience? And more importantly, what do you do with it? How do you understand it? So the drugs were a way for me to get a negative answer to a question that I had, which was, could you induce spiritual experiences with drugs? And you can, but it doesn't have as much to do with the drug as the person, what they're thinking about and how they act. So those seemed more fundamental, and drugs were a tool for me to figure that out.
So, that was your original intention when you started the research? It was around spirituality and spiritual experience?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things that drove me to the study. Uh, I really liked chemistry as a kid, and I liked brain chemistry. So I wanted to understand the brain chemistry of spiritual experience, where in the brain, how in the brain. Um, and, then that led me to the idea of changing brain chemistry with a psychedelic uh, drug in order to cause a spiritual experience. But the study itself, those motivations or those ideas behind the research were pretty implicit. The explicit study goals were to just reopen the field of psychedelic drug research in the US after so long, and to understand the role of DMT in the body, because DMT is perhaps the only psychedelic compound made in the human body. And it was once believed important for the production of psychosis, like schizophrenia. And it's also an abused drug and the prototype of the larger family of the tryptamine psychedelics, like psilocybin, ayahuasca, even LSD. So I approached the study from the point of view of the funders and the regulators as a groundbreaking psychopharmacology study with relevance to psychosis and to drug abuse. But the deeper motivations weren't that well formed, but if I could look back and say what they were, I would say it was to understand the biology or the chemistry of spiritual experience. So I believe you could give a drug to anyone with minimal preparation, minimal supervision, and the drug itself possessed the spiritual potential. So that didn't really turn out to be the case with DMT anyway. What we found with minimal preparation and minimal supervision was that people just became a kind of a magnified version of who they already were. They just became more of who they were, or more firm in their belief about the truths of certain things. So it, clearly the effect of the DMT was profound. It was huge. But at the same time, the content of the information that they received, what they came back with, the information, the message, was a function of that person. So it would vary quite a bit depending on the individual.
Okay, so before we dive into making sense of the DMT experience or trying to make sense of it, I'm curious, you are suggesting or you propose that DMT allows us to perceive other realities. Is that correct?
Um, yeah, I think that's true. But it's important to distinguish between inner realities and outer realities. Are we perceiving things on DMT which exist objectively, external to ourselves, or are those newly perceivable realities just residing within our own mind-brain complex?
So how do you distinguish between the two?
That's a tough one. Uh, if you go back maybe, well, I mean, you wouldn't even have to go back. It still is a belief, but the consensus about spiritual worlds up until the Enlightenment, the 1500s or so, was that those spiritual worlds existed outside of us. That spiritual experience kind of lifts the veil, and you can see things which are always around us that are normally invisible. But with the Enlightenment and the rise of humanism and man being the center of the universe, or humans being the center of the universe, uh, the mind became the center of man in a way, and everything that was perceived was just reflections off the screen that no, that's not quite a good analogy. Yeah, that they were the product of the mind brain complex, either uh, conflicts or goals or wishes or forgotten memories. uh, Everything became symbolic, rather than real.
Okay.
So that's still the case with primitive Americans and primitive other people around the world. They haven't been influenced by the secular humanism of the educated class. Um, fundamentalists, people who live by faith, experience and understand those phenomena as occurring in a spiritual world that's external, objective to them.
Okay. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying here or what you're suggesting. Is their mindset, their belief system going to be coloring their experience or it is creating their experience?
Well, I think somewhere in between is that it's determining their experience. They wouldn't be having that experience if they weren't who they were in the first place.
So can you give an example of what you mean by that?
Uh, well, yeah, like, one of our volunteers um, was a nurse who really loved the near death experience, or studying it, or learning about it, and hearing people talk about it. And she wanted a near death experience as the end result of participating in our DMT research. So, she had a near death experience, or one that resembled the common typical description of an NDE. There was a tunnel, there was beings on one side or the other. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. There was conflict, and then the spirits would help lift her up and take her to where she wished to go. Um, so what was that? Was it just her brain mind complex making it up, or was she now able to perceive an externally objective world of spirits and the white light and the tunnel, which exist all the time out there, but we are only able to perceive them uh, at certain times. In in this volunteer's case, that's certain times uh, being as a result of getting a big dose of DMT. So that's the inner world, the inner self-generated pole of the spectrum. The other being, it's real, it's out there, and the DMT allowed her to see it, or the DMT stimulated her imagination to experience it, but it was all in her mind. It's all in her mind anyway, and her mind steered the effect. It interpreted it in a particular way. It hoped for it. Um, so that didn't occur in any of our other volunteers.
So you think her intention really kind of set the tone for that experience? Her intention
Well,
being that she wanted to have a near-death
yeah.
experience.
Well, only one part is the intention. That's one of the elements of what's called a set, what you bring to the drug experience. So there's intention, there's your health, physical and mental. There's the experiences that you've had in your life. There's things you've studied. There's things you're hoping for. There's things you're afraid of. There's certain ways you understand the world and experiences like that, which will determine what kind of information you can extract from those things that you see. So, the intention is key, and kind of clarifying the intention and solidifying it. That's part, or a major part of the drug research going on nowadays. Is there's 10 to 12 hours of preparatory psychotherapy where you're educated about the drugs, their effects, what you hope will be accomplished by your participation in the study. You learn, how, to manage the, trips in a certain way. You're coached. You establish rapport with the therapeutic team. So there's quite a bit of focus placed on the preparatory work, and a large part of that is clarifying the intent.
So it makes me curious about, and I wanted to ask you this question anyway, but for somebody like me who started having spontaneous visionary experiences where there was no intention, it just happened. What do you suggest is going on in an instance like that?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. Let me write them. Well, let's see. Well, one of them is, how do you understand that? And on the other thing is,
Me personally?
yeah. Do you think you're envisioning things which are outside of yourself, or is it just your brain, firing in a particular new pattern?
No, for me, I felt like I was having a waking dream that was not my own, so it did not feel like it was part of me.
Yeah, well, that's a common phenomenon with the DMT effect. Is it does feel like it's outside of you. It's more real than real. That's a common refrain. And with regard to spontaneous spiritual experiences of that sort, it is tempting to propose a role for endogenous DMT. Let's say it's spontaneously increasing. But so far we aren't able to prove that objectively. It's too difficult to measure levels of DMT in the body right now. But to the extent that non-drug states resemble those brought on by administering DMT, it makes sense that endogenous DMT may be involved.
Or I'm psychotic.
Well, and endogenous DMT could play a similar role there.
But I'm high functioning.
Well, it's interesting. Are you having an enlightenment experience, or are you psychotic? I mean, that's a very big question. A number of people who read my prophetic states book say, well, weren't all the prophets psychotic?
Yeah.
especially Ezekiel. If you read Ezekiel, you'll say, "Oh man." So it just depends on your lens. It depends on, you know, your understanding. What you're looking for. You know, uh, there was a study that was done in Germany, 2005, I think, where they gave DMT to normal volunteers. But instead of giving them a mystical experience questionnaire, they gave them a schizophrenia questionnaire, and the scores were quite high. So, it just depends on what your rating scale is, I guess, if you're going to call it psychosis or enlightenment. I think also, you know, being a little, less glib is it, depends on the person in whom that experience is occurring. Are they otherwise, sane? They're healthy. They, functioning members of society. Uh, are they peaceful? That's one type of person who could be having those experiences. Somebody else could be brain damaged from birth or from trauma. They could be psychologically pretty sick, physically not well, smoking 2 packs a day, drinking. And in that kind of a person, then those states won't really be incorporated or integrated very well, and either into the person or the larger society.
So you released the book, The Soul of Prophecy. In that book, you examine the DMT experience through the lens of the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
Do you think that that is the only way to explain these experiences or the best way? I'm referring back to your legacy answer now.
Uh, what do you mean?
Well, because you said I want people to know the two main truths of the Hebrew Bible, that I want
Hmm.
that to be my legacy. And so I'm tying that into the DMT experience. Do you feel that a religious model is the only way to explain these experiences?
No, no, of course not. There's the this is your brain on drugs model, the pure psychopharmacology one. There's the psychoanalytic model. That's the things that you perceive are unconscious conflicts or memories, uh, drives, goals, wishes. There's a shamanic model. There's the spiritual model, and I think the uh, interesting part or the valuable part of a spiritual model is that it tries to extract information from those states to teach us the right way to think or believe, right beliefs and the right way to behave, right action. So once I, decided that the real questions that were driving me were more theological than biochemical, I started looking at various religious uh, traditions, most of which incorporate in some form or another altered states of consciousness, a specific type called spiritual or religious experience. So shamanism is a model. Eastern religions are a model. The Western religions are a model, and for uh, various reasons, I think a Western model is a good one. And well, yeah, well, in a way, or primarily, or solely anyway. The reason that I believe that the Hebrew Bible is a good model is because it's been ignored up until now as a model of the psychedelic experience or as a way to understand and work with the psychedelic experience. It's all been, well, if you go into a head shop, you never find a sculpture of the Ten Commandments or, Moses on the mountain. You see tonkas, you see, shamanic uh, instruments and tools, you see prayer beads. You might see a Christian cross, but there's not much. Judaica in contemporary head shops, and traditional Judaism isn't really part of the discussion when it comes to the spiritual aspects of the psychedelic drug state. So I'm kind of saying that it's worth at least looking at a Western model, uh, and the beauty of Judaism is its simplicity. It's what you could refer to as ethical monotheism, which is a way to encompass those two notions that I brought up earlier: the one God and living an ethical, moral uh, life according to the golden rule.
All right. You wanted to represent, it sounds like you wanted to represent the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, it was a kind of a roundabout way to get there. I kind of exhausted the psychopharmacology model. The shamanic model, I just didn't know that much about it. The psychological model, treated the experiences as something else, which isn't how those experiences are felt. They're felt as to be as real as everyday reality, even more so. And it was of a freestanding plane of existence. So, I mean, who is to say that's not happening? There's no way to disprove it at this point. So taking that as a given, or at least a chosen given, like I choose to use that as a given. Um, what are the spiritual models? Buddhism, at least Zen Buddhism, which is uh, the Buddhist tradition that I had trained in up until the mid 1990s. It also treated the visions and the voices of the DMT state as unreal, as essentially unreal. That they were in a way resistances to the unformed enlightened state. One without any content or emotion or time or space or individual personality. But the DMT effect wasn't that way at all. It was quite interactive, full of content. So in order to, well, okay, so the Zen approach didn't, really comport with, the data, with, the DMT data. In all of our volunteers, maybe one person had an enlightenment kind of experience, and to return to the idea of the drug's work on a particular person's mind. The one person who underwent an enlightenment experience was a religious studies major in college who always wanted to have an enlightenment experience. And so, with his, focus, his intent, with all his years of study and prayer and practice, with the jumpstart, as it were, the catalyst of a big dose of DMT, he had an enlightenment experience. But that's quite rare. One person out of nearly 5 dozen. So there were a number of factors that led to me, leaving the Zen community in the mid 1990s, and I thought, well, I'm Jewish. I should start, looking into Jewish spirituality. Yeah, and Jewish spirituality devolves from the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. That's the original source. So I started to read the Bible for an alternative to those decades of Zen practice and study. But also I was wondering in the back of my mind, maybe the Jewish model of spiritual experience, or the model presented in the Hebrew Bible for spiritual experience, overlapped more closely with both the phenomena of the DMT effect, as well as how people understood that effect to be more real than real. So after bracing myself and getting into the Hebrew Bible, I retaught myself biblical Hebrew. I got some dictionaries, the main commentaries, without which you really can't understand the text. So I began to think about this prophetic state of consciousness, which possesses many of the same qualities as the DMT effect. Like if you read Ezekiel chapter 1, it's all about spinning balls and globes and wheels and fire and ice and roaring sounds and wings and beings and eyes. It's just completely DMT-like. So I compared the two states, the prophetic state and the DMT state, from a phenomenology point of view, the visions and the voices and the extreme emotions and physical experiences. And there was a very strong overlap, but there was obviously a big difference. The endurability, the endurance of the biblical message, compared to the endurance of the DMT message. The phenomenology of the two states were quite similar, but the content, the information content, the message which people were able to return with was relatively meager compared to just their description of the state. But if you look at the prophetic literature, the state itself is only a means of exchanging the communication between the spiritual realm and the person perceiving it. And it's a prelude. It's the mechanism by which the information is conveyed. And the information being conveyed is obviously key in the Hebrew Bible. It isn't the descriptions of the psychedelic-like prophetic experiences. It's the prophetic message, the narratives and the wisdom, the call to repentance, the promise of redemption. Those are the important take-home lessons from the Bible, and those are the ones which influence people for the last 2,000, 2,500 years around the world. Billions and billions of people are immersed or believe in or study the Hebrew Bible, to the preference of any other tradition. So if you look at the message of the prophetic experience, that is the major difference between the DMT effect and the prophetic state of consciousness.
So the message within the prophetic state is coming from.
Well, that's the same question. Is it just their minds going kind of in a different place that they just had wild imaginations and were pious at the same time? Spinoza thinks it's impossible to understand the prophetic state. In fact, he thinks most explanations are pretty meek or pretty weak, pretty meager. Um, he just thinks that the prophets uh, were were pious individuals with vivid imaginations. They were mostly public nuisances. But if you look at the other extreme, it's that the prophetic message is downloaded from God, and is flashed in your mind, and then you need to figure out what the information is that those images represent, and then find some way to communicate them to the larger community.
Is that what you believe, that the prophets in the Hebrew Bible were receiving messages from God?
Um, in a nutshell, yes.
Okay, and then if we look at the DMT experience, the subjects in your study, would you say that they were receiving messages from God, or would you say that that it was more of a, like you were saying earlier in the conversation, it's more of a byproduct of what they want to see, their intention or their belief systems, and not a God message?
Well, yeah, I think that well, so uh, if you prescribe to the view that these are experiences of communicating with divinity, uh, with God, there still can be a role for naturally occurring DMT. that the increase of endogenous DMT, if it occurs, would be responsible for the visions and the voices. But the form of those visions and those voices are determined from above. They're determined by God, who is encapsulating, as it were, certain information in the images. And then it's up to the mind of the prophet to interpret what those images mean, to translate them, as it were. In the case of my volunteers, the increase of DMT came from me injecting it into them, as opposed to being the result of divine influence from above, down into the brain. So the source of the elevated DMT was of elevated DMT in the brain was completely different, and nobody was really steeped in that type of prophetic tradition or stream. So they just didn't experience things in the way somebody might who was living in ancient Israel at the time of the kings, who had a certain mission to accomplish. Um, so the vocabulary, the form that the experience would take in my DMT volunteers would be a completely different species. They were volunteering to be in a study paid for by NIH, approved by the DEA, as opposed to Ezekiel, who just was heartbroken because of the fall of Jerusalem, and he follows the exiles into captivity. So the setting was different. The set was quite different. So and the individuals themselves were quite different. So I think there is this notion of suitable container. Somebody that's prepared, that lives a pure life, or relatively virtuous life, uh, studies, let's say, theological and academic fields to improve their intellect, their reasoning capacities. Those kind of people would be more suitable for divine influence, as opposed to just anyone who volunteered for my study that could take DMT. That isn't to say that the volunteers were not working on themselves. All of them pretty much were involved in some spiritual practice, meditating. It was a high functioning group, doctors, lawyers, psychologists. But still, they weren't cut from the prophetic cloth as articulated in the Hebrew Bible. So I think their experiences worked on who they were. The DMT worked on their personalities, as opposed. And I think in the case of the prophetic experience, it also works on their personalities. But the source of the DMT stimulation, as it were, and the person of the person undergoing that state, their personality and their character, were quite different and would produce a different outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I want to ask a clarifying question, though. If you had a room filled with rabbis and you gave them DMT, do you think they would be more likely to have what you're calling a prophetic experience?
Well, that's a tough one. Lots of rabbis aren't that well schooled in the Hebrew Bible. So if they have a mystical bent, it's more in line with Kabbalah, which is more of the mystical white light union with God kind of effect. So if a contemporary rabbi was even interested in prophetic experience, it wouldn't be most likely from a traditional scriptural point of view, the canonical prophets. So even in that case, you would need to be prepared. in a way that would not be all that naturally occurring, let's say in the field of rabbinic Judaism. That also, raises the question of, can one attain to the prophetic state, nowadays? The rabbis, declared an end to prophecy in about 100 BCE, maybe, closer to the Common Era. Somewhere between 100 BCE and 100 CE, they declared an end to prophecy. And, that was a rather complicated decision. As a result of the end of prophecy, there were no more prophetic books then. So the canon of the Hebrew Bible was closed. No new books could be added. The last one to be added was Daniel in 150 CE. So I think part of that was to fend off the newly formed Christian religion, who wanted to kind of tack on their own canonical works to make Christian literature part of the Hebrew Bible. So the rabbis weren't keen on that idea. So that was probably another reason to close the canon as a result of saying there's no more prophecies, so there's no more canonical prophetic works. Also, prophecy is a disturbing mission. Nobody wishes to become a prophet in the Hebrew Bible. They complain. It's just no fun because you're pretty much an outcast, and the government is after you because you're speaking truth to power. So if a person would then, this was around the time of the Roman occupation. So you wouldn't want prophets speaking to the Roman Empire. To the Roman Empire. It would be one thing for Jeremiah to speak to the king of Israel, like a small kingdom without a lot of influence. But you're not going to talk back to the Romans if your country is occupied by the Romans. So just to keep the peace, the rabbis would call anybody in their day and age that was claiming to be a prophet. They called them crazy or a rabble rouser or like a rebel. But not a prophet. So the Romans wouldn't get worried. The people wouldn't get worked up about overthrowing the government. So there were political issues as well. But even with the declaration of the end of prophecy, it continued. Prophecy continued. If you read the deuterocanonical books, the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha, all those characters are having spiritual experiences. The Talmudic rabbis had what was called the daughter of a voice, the bat kol, which spoke from heaven. If that isn't prophecy, then what is? And with the development of the Hasidic traditions in the 1700s, there was a return to an interest in spiritual experience, which to all extents seemed like a prophetic state. The Zohar, Kabbalah is all about spiritual practices which would induce a spiritual experience. And within the Hebrew Bible, or within normative Judaism, the spiritual experience is prophecy. So if they're having a spiritual experience, then they're entering into a prophetic state. So that's been continuing in practice, if not in theory or in the academic organizational literature.
Well, it's definitely terrain I am not familiar with. A heathen like me, who's been having these, a heathen and a clinician who's been having these visionary experiences for the last, I don't know, 20 years. I mean, I can just speak from the frame of reference that I have around what my experiences have taught me. And that is that reality is complex, and it seems to be, depending on where you're focusing when you go into a visionary state, that's going to color your experience. I personally have never been interested in having the nirvana type experience where all of the boundaries slip away and you become one with everything. It just hasn't been of interest to me. I'm more interested in the shamanic realms. I guess that's the frame of reference that I have, where everything is symbolic, and that it seems like super rich territory, and learning the language of symbolism and what it represents, and then when you don't understand it, you ask it. You ask the symbol what it's trying to tell you, which probably sounds batshit, but that's
No, no, I mean, not at all. But at the same time, how do you tell if they're telling you the truth?
the symbols themselves.
Yeah, how do you know you're not being deceived?
Ah, that is a great question. One of the things I've discovered is that there seems to be a place where people can get caught, which I would call the mental realm. So it's kind of like the framework of your beliefs and your thoughts. And in that place, deception seems to live. And it gets really tricky. And I think some people get caught in that place when they go into a visionary state. And you can get kind of twisted around, and because deception is slippery, it can make you very, I think, convinced that what you're perceiving is true. I think that is the question I am most interested in, is what is the truth? How do you know when you've experienced the truth? I've been looking at this a lot. I've had enough direct experience where I've had experience of, I mean, I don't know if I have an answer of what is true versus what isn't, but I can say that I hope I'm getting closer to, because I guess because it has to do with my direct experience. So if I have a direct experience that leads to some sort of positive transformation in myself, then I could say that there was maybe some truth in that. Maybe it was just a personal truth, maybe not a universal truth, whatever that is. I don't know, but it's something I've wrestled with, that question you're asking. How do you know what's true? And I think that's a really tough one.
Well, I think it points to the notion of false prophecy versus true prophecy, which I talk about in my prophetic states book. Yeah, because that's an important question. Are you being misled? Are you misleading yourself? Are you misleading others? So that's why it's good to have benchmarks, cognitive benchmarks. Uh, and that's one of the ways the text, at least my understanding of the Hebrew Bible, can be quite helpful. If the information that you're receiving isn't contradicting the idea of one God and the golden rule, then it isn't false prophecy. You also would be looking at the character of the prophet. Are his experiences or her experiences taking place in a good person, or is this a complete, psychopathic maniac? You wouldn't, believe the pronouncements, no matter how beautiful or lofty or convincing, from a psychopath or from a murderer or from a bad person, beats their spouse, drinks, robs, kills. Yeah, so it's the person of the prophet and the message, which would determine false versus true prophecy.
Well, I do think that ethics are a super important part of this practice, or any spiritual practice. And I guess I would be considered a false prophet, since I'm an atheist, at least from your perspective.
Mm, yeah, I mean, you scratch an atheist and you find a believer. I have, generally found. Yeah, you can, yeah, like if you've decided well, yeah. Well, so tell me how you define being an atheist.
Well, I don't believe in a God.
You don't believe in a God. Well, you don't believe that God exists.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, so how did you arrive at that thought?
I've been an atheist probably since I was like 12, but I looked into it in the shamanic realms to see if I could find evidence of a god, and I had an experience, or I've had actually many experiences that I could say were god-like, but I wouldn't attribute them, or call them the god of of the Bible?
Well, the God of the Bible is misunderstood terribly. That is the God who created the universe and sustains it through the natural world and through the moral world, the ethical world, behavioral cause and effect. So, there are descriptions of God in the Bible which are pretty primitive, but those suit most people. Most people don't really train their intellects to extract information from the natural world and observing the ethical world. But if you've got the mind, you've got the patience and the inclination, you could, through observation of the natural world, through personal experience, through teachers that you really believe and trust, you can you, you can come to an understanding, working backwards, as it were, of the existence of God. If things are such and such a way, it must be the the workings of God. You really can't know God. You can approach God. You could praise, thank God, but seeing God's attributes are impossible because they're just incomprehensible. You can't comprehend eternity or infinity. You just can't comprehend it. You can't comprehend things before time and before space. And that is the residence, as it were, of the God of the Hebrew Bible.
So, how are you certain that God exists?
By uh, Well, because there is something rather than nothing, and there's the natural world, and there's moral and ethical cause and effect. Those are facts, and so where did that come from, and why is it a particular way? And that's where I got my original insights into God's nature and activities. You don't really know God's nature, but you can observe God's activities, the maintenance of the laws of nature, uh, reward and punishment, as it were, cause and effect. If you do certain things, other things are going to follow.
I can see how someone could come to that conclusion that has to be the byproduct of a God.
You know, it's a Yeah, it's a fraught concept. Most people stop thinking about God, when they're 10 or 12 or 13, maybe even earlier if something bad happened to them. So they really don't look into the idea of God. What's this thing about God, as adults, and that's why I'm really glad for my Zen training. To be honest, is it kind of made me a lot more objective about studying things that may trigger me. Like, okay, I'm being triggered. This is triggering, but that wouldn't necessarily stop me from trying to understand what's in the text. So, as an adult, you can return to the Bible in a lot more, anxiety-free manner than may have been the case when you're a child. But nevertheless, most people don't want to go there. They've kind of had it with the whole idea of the Hebrew God. Well, throwing lightning bolts and punishing and being jealous and being petty and changing his mind and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, it's very complicated. It requires a lot of study and a lot of patience and a lot of working through childhood spiritual trauma.
Gotcha. Well, I always thought the God of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, sounded very human.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah. Well, there's a saying, uh, you know, th- that the Bible is spoken in the language of humans, the language of man. The Bible speaks in the language of man.
So we could understand.
Yeah, like for example, there's comment, or there's mentions of God's hand. or his arm. But those are just simple ways of symbolizing power or authority or direction, firmness, steadfastness. So it's an anthropomorphizing of processes which are more abstract and more difficult to comprehend.
Well, I'm aware of the time. We're coming up on an hour here. And if it's okay, I'd just like to ask you a really quick question on your thoughts getting back to DMT. I had no idea we are going to go this deep down the God hole. But but I was just wondering what your thoughts are around psychedelic assisted therapies and DMT, psilocybin coming into the mainstream. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing or?
Well, it's a great thing if it helps people that aren't being helped by current treatments. And that seems to be the case with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy for depression, for OCD, end of life distress. So that's a great thing. I mean, I'm all for it. The thing I don't want to see happen is the book being closed prematurely on how psychedelics work. I think we just don't know. So to say it's because of a mystical experience or because it's a horrible experience or because psychoanalytic processes are being activated, I think we need to stay modest about the mechanism. We don't want to become fundamentalistic. It isn't only ego dissolution. It isn't only confrontation with your shadow. Yeah, it could be any number of things. And I think the more we study how psychedelics work, the more we will know about the mind in general, about how the mind creates reality and interacts with it.
That makes sense. So I want to pass on my giant gratitude for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and I hope that my my comments about God weren't off-putting.
No, you should hear the kind of comments I get. So that's fine. Well, was it okay to go down that rabbit hole? I mean, people take psychedelics for so-called spiritual reasons. So why not just go to the heart of the matter?
That's kind of how I roll.
Yeah, good, good. Yeah, the proof's in the pudding too, as they say. You'll be hearing from your listeners.
I'm sure I will.
Oh, speaking of your listeners, please visit my website, rickstrassman.com, and I have a Facebook page, so you can follow me there too.
All right, you beat me to it. I was going to ask you if there's a way people can contact you, so that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It was a really interesting conversation.
Well, thanks, Wendy. Thanks for having me.
All righty. I thought it might be helpful to clarify one of the things I mentioned during my conversation with Rick. I referenced a godlike experience, and you may be wondering what the hell I was talking about. Of course, as always, please take everything I say with a grain of salt. I can't physically prove anything I'm about to say. It's just my experience. You don't have to buy it. The hard part, though, is trying to put this into words. Over the years of having shamanic visionary experiences, actually, I should probably clarify that they were drug-free visionary experiences, I had some really powerful mind-expanding encounters with what I would refer to as an aspect of my consciousness. I like the word oversoul, but higher self or higher consciousness also works. The best way to describe this part of myself, my oversoul, and I'd like to suggest that we all have a personal oversoul field, is that it's not human. It has no beliefs, no body, no gender. It's the embodiment of love and wisdom. And what I've come to understand is that this part of me, my oversoul, is dreaming me, Wendy, into existence. So in essence, each one of us is being dreamed into physical existence by our personal oversoul field. I'd like to suggest, and again, you don't have to buy into this idea, that when people have spiritual experiences where they feel as though they're communing with God, that it's actually their oversoul. Because when you encounter your personal oversoul, it's mighty humbling, which is a perfect jumping off point for addressing why I struggle with religion. I don't strive to be controversial, but this is one area where I'm okay sticking my neck out a bit because I feel like it's that important. So my wish for every human being is that they feel powerful. I'm talking about personal power, a sense of agency, the ability to access your own wisdom, to move through each day no matter what's happening, knowing that you have access to everything you need within you, and therefore you can get through anything. And to me, religion fosters the opposite, powerlessness. I strongly believe that we don't need books or texts to give us a code of ethics or a sense of morality or a deity to pray to or special representatives of that deity or religion wearing really great outfits and hats, acting as a moral compass, when it's clear that each one of us is so full of shit. To me, the idea is to evolve, to be less full of shit, which is always my goal. And really, the only way to do that is to go within and figure it out for yourself. And this is a very intimate, personal process. For me, shamanism has been the tool. There's a reason why shamanism has found a way to survive for tens of thousands of years. At its core, it's a highly focused and intense form of meditation. Like with any spiritual practice, you can add dogma to shamanism and make it a religion. You need to walk clockwise around the sacred fire. You need to sacrifice a virgin to appease the gods. And from where I stand, dogma is just adding layers of bullshit. If you strip away the bullshit and just use the basic practice of shamanic visioning, setting an intention, safely altering your consciousness so that you can explore the incredibly vast terrain of your consciousness, you'll figure some shit out. And you won't be the same afterwards. And the best part is you did it yourself. And that's power. You don't need religion to do this. You don't need a god to do this. And I'd like to believe that if you're not a sociopath, you can figure out how to be a good, moral, ethical person. The trickiest part is identifying the areas in which you're so very full of shit, and then admitting it. So if you're looking for a mentor or a teacher on the shamanic path or any path, please know that there are a lot of them out there who are very full of shit. If you work with someone who makes you feel powerless, run the fuck away. So, that's why I'm not a fan of religion. I don't think we need it, and I think it actually keeps us from evolving. So, send any hate mail to my mom. She'll make sure I get it. I'm officially stepping off my soapbox now. If you're still with me, thanks for listening. Until next time.